Out of the stars in their flight, out of the dust of eternity, here we have come. Stardust and sunlight, breezes moving through time and through space. Time out of time before time, in the vastness of space, Earth spun to orbit the sun, Earth with thunder of mountains reborn, the boiling seas. Ponder this thing in your heart. Life up from the sea, eyes to behold, throats to sing, mates to love. This is the marvel of life, rising to see and to know. Out of your heart cry wonder, sing that we live. Sing that we live. Good morning. Good morning to all of you, and welcome to our service here on October 17th at First Parish Church in Weston. Most of you know me. I will just say, since we're recording this, I am Jeff Barsnell, and we are delighted to have you join us both here in person or later on a recording on this lovely, lovely, gorgeous fall day. It is a crisp fall day. It's not too chilly out, right? It's crisp. The word is crisp. If anyone gets really a little bit of a chill, the sun is coming this way, encroaching as it is. As it makes its way up into the sky, we will have less and less shade to benefit from. So it is a lovely morning indeed. Would you please rise up in body and in spirit? We're going to sing two verses of our opening hymn, Earth Was Given as a Garden. So I'm going to do something this morning that I never thought I would do in a sermon. I'm going to mention Captain Kirk. As most of us know, this last week, the well-known Canadian actor William Shatner truly went where no actor has gone before. He was one of 4 individuals launched up into space as a guest of the billionaire businessman Jeff Bezos, who's now turned into something of a billionaire space enthusiast. Mr. Bezos' company, Blue Origin, is vying to be the first for-profit company to launch private passengers into space. For the sum of tens of millions of dollars, you too can sign up for a 10-minute trip up beyond the outer edges of the atmosphere and behold the wondrous view and experience weightlessness for 3 glorious, fun-filled minutes. Just hurry back to your seat. No doubt Blue Origin and at least a few other companies think this is a major market for space tourism, as it's being called. And they are probably right. Now, truth be told, I didn't plan to mention this in a sermon since I question the ethics of billionaires spending billions of dollars on a private space program that will only benefit a few thousand people on the planet who are themselves only slightly less rich than they are. These pursuits for the wealthy almost feel profane when there are still 3.5 billion people around the world who are not vaccinated. There are 1 million people suffering through a multi-year famine in Madagascar and millions of ethnic Uyghurs being persecuted in China. Surely some of these billionaires could find ways to help their fellow humanity a little bit more and pursue their egotistical, wholly unsustainable rocket in the sky pursuits a little bit less. But I digress. I am going to mention this spaceflight. What caught my and many others' attention was this video of William Shatner after he immediately emerged from the space capsule upon returning to Earth. First of all, the guy is 90 years old and seemed like he managed his short trip into space just fine, including enduring 5 Gs on the re-entry in the capsule. More importantly, he did more than just help Jeff Bezos with a glorified publicity stunt. William Shatner had tears in his eyes as he described how beautiful the Earth looked from the edge of space. And he was amazed at how thin and fragile our atmosphere was. You could pierce through it in a few short seconds, he kept saying. He was overwhelmed as he peered into the utter blackness of space above the capsule and the utter beauty of the blue atmosphere curving away from him below on the planet. He realized how incredibly small, how absolutely incredibly small and precious everything we take for granted is. And to his credit, he stated in several of his interviews how important it was that we stop polluting the atmosphere and find better ways to protect this thin blue envelope of nitrogen and oxygen gases that primarily make up the Earth's atmosphere. I remember years ago hearing the famous astronomer Carl Sagan describe the real scope and scale of our atmosphere. He said that if you took a basketball, not a baseball, I'm thinking too much about the Red Sox, a basketball, and painted it with a coat of varnish, just a simple coat of varnish, that would actually be the approximate size and thickness of the atmosphere compared to the Earth below. The actual atmosphere might even be a little bit thinner, proportionally speaking, than that coat of varnish to the basketball. In other words, the layer of air that encircles the Earth, on which our lives and the lives of every living being depends, is relatively speaking very, very small, especially when compared to the 2 other major systems that make up this planet, and that would be rock and dirt and water. So part of me hopes that Mr. Shatner's trip into space, Captain Kirk's last voyage, was not just a publicity stunt, but also a call for folks to pay attention to what is happening around the world with weather events and what is occurring at the end of this month to address our global challenges. How many of us are aware this day that there is a major global summit about climate change scheduled to begin on October 31st? That's a pretty good number. This must be a UU church. The next Conference of Parties meeting is happening in Glasgow, Scotland. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is convening this gathering of the world's nations for the first 2 weeks of November. The goal of this COP meeting, as it's called, is to hammer out a binding agreement between major nations of the world as they make formal commitments to reduce their use of fossil fuel consumption and reduce their emissions of carbon dioxide. Lest we forget, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is the largest scientific body of scientists ever assembled to study any natural phenomenon in the history of the world. Their mission is to measure and assess the status of our atmosphere and then report what they find as clearly as possible to the rest of us. Informed by the latest scientific findings of peer-reviewed data, they then make recommendations about what we need to do as nations and as a species in order to avoid runaway climate change. The latest reports tell us what we already know, namely that the climate is changing all over the world with devastating impacts happening to hundreds of millions of people and other living beings already. The drought-like conditions out west are causing an increased number of wildfires in California and in the Pacific Northwest. The Colorado River is drying up, which serves as the drinking water source to over 40 million Americans, and the irrigation source for major agricultural areas in the valleys of southern and mid-California. Indeed, Lake Mead, just outside of Las Vegas, is over 100 feet below where it historically has been in terms of its levels. The glaciers in the Himalayas are melting, reducing the amount of water that feeds the 7 major river systems in Southeast Asia, which serve or provide the drinking water for 40% of the world's population. Meanwhile, there are devastating tropical storms impacting Louisiana and parts of Asia, also impacting agriculture. Currently, there is a multi-year drought occurring in Madagascar off the coast of Africa. The lack of rain has become so dire that the UN estimates that over 1 million people are currently suffering amidst famine-like conditions, and that could get worse. The United Nations and the IPCC, by the way, also won a Nobel Peace Prize. The UN and the IPCC have concluded that the nations of the world need to keep the average global temperature from rising above 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2.9 degrees Fahrenheit. Keep 1.5 alive, as many activists are saying right now in advance of the upcoming meeting. Already we've experienced a 0.7 degree or 1.5 degree increase, and we know what is happening. Thus, there has been a series of increasingly urgent meetings in which countries are being asked to reduce their carbon emissions by at least 45% by 2030 and by 90% or more by 2050. This would keep, can you hear the airplane? That's loud. This would keep CO2 emissions in the atmosphere below 450 parts per million and hopefully stabilize our climate. Even then, human beings will spend the next few centuries retreating from the coast as the world's oceans inexorably rise. Indeed, I do not recommend purchasing a lot of waterfront property during your lifetime and planning on leaving it to your children and grandchildren. Probably a bad long-term strategy. Now, I know when I say these things out loud and describe the recommendations of the IPCC and the urgent need to reduce carbon emissions by 50% in 9 years and 90% in 29 years, some people roll their eyes. I'm accused of being overly political and unrealistic. I have had folks point out that there are other points of view, and that is indeed the case. There is the point of view of the IPCC, based on rigorous, decades-long scientific assessment of the Earth's atmosphere. And there is the point of view of major fossil fuel companies and their proxies who have a vested financial interest in the current status quo. There always have been changes to the weather, and these variations are natural and to be expected, so they argue. I actually had one person come up to me a few years ago and tell me that while they agreed with much of what I was saying, they can't agree 100% because that would mean that they might need to sell their shares of ExxonMobil, and they really can't do that right now. They need the income. I actually really appreciated them saying this because it was both very human and very honest, and to some extent understandable. The truth of the matter is, I am willing to risk being seen as overly political or excessive about the climate crisis by some if it means we can have a real dialogue with a whole lot of us. I subscribe to the Wall Street Journal, and I'm quite aware of the criticism and the questions about climate change that are often raised on the editorial pages of that famous paper. There are a whole variety of important questions and issues to work out in terms of how to respond to the global crisis. I agree with that. How do you convince different nations who've been polluting for certain periods of time to limit their emissions? And how do you do that equitably with respect to all the other nations of the world? What I take issue with, though, in the Wall Street Journal and other news outlets are those who minimize or dismiss the growing threat of what is actually happening around the world and suggest that folks like me are coming on a little too strong. Suggest that the problem is being overblown for the sake of advancing some progressive pro-government agenda. I don't just disagree with the Wall Street Journal, at least their opinion page. I don't just disagree with the editorial writers on climate issues. I think they are dead wrong in many cases. The scientific consensus has only gotten more clear, and the implications are only more concerning. When I talk about the climate crisis, I'm not trying, therefore, to be political, but rather existential, even moral. I'm trying to speak to one set of assumptions about the world based on a different and a new set of values and information. We really cannot use the amount of fossil fuel and natural resources that we do now as a society and a country, since it's just not sustainable. The truth of the matter is that if everyone on this planet enjoyed the lifestyle of the average American, you and me, we would need somewhere between 4 to 5 planet Earths to provide all of the water and energy that we use on a sustainable basis. And we don't have 4 planet Earths. We have one lovely, beautiful planet that is increasingly stressed by the activities of one species, us. We have met the enemy, and they are us. I hear some scholars and thought leaders describing this time in human history as a struggle between living according to two stories. That's an interesting metaphor. The well-known writer and theologian Thomas Berry made this point in a very well-known and influential essay that he wrote 40 years ago. I actually had the chance to study briefly with Thomas Berry during a graduate seminar in the 1990s. He led part of a class on environmental ethics and law that I took at Harvard Law School. I talked my way into that class since they wanted to have a few more students studying the ministry and a few less students studying the law, at least for that seminar. Thomas Berry begins his famous essay with the following statement: "It's a question of story. We are in trouble now because we do not have a good story. We're between stories. The old story, the account of how the world came to be and how we fit into it, is no longer functioning properly, and we have not learned the new story. The old story sustained us for a long time. It shaped our emotional attitudes. It provided us with a life purpose. It consecrated suffering, integrated knowledge, and guided education. We awoke in the morning, and we knew where we were. It did not make people feel good all the time. It did not take away the pains and the stupidities of life, or make for unfailing warmth and human association, but it did. It did provide a context in which life could function in a meaningful manner." Thomas Berry goes on to point out that all of us who are alive right now, have lived through a very short and unique period in the time of this old story. It is the period of time known as the fossil fuel age. For most of human history, people and communities lived off of the energy they could harness more or less sustainably from wood and water and indirectly from livestock. It was only 200 or so years ago that we discovered ways to harness the power of hydrocarbons and to accomplish feats and amounts of work that previous generations could have only dreamed of. Thank you, James Watt, and many others. Even the way we describe power connects us back to this previous, more sustainable bygone era. That's why cars are still rated in terms of horsepower. In the old age, this God-given right to use any and all fossil fuels is just assumed. And in the old story, there are no impacts. There are no reactions to this level of consumption. Pollution and contamination are simply not factors. All that matters is private citizens being able to pursue their own individual interests and agenda with a minimum of outside influence or involvement. This old story also perpetuated a sense of separation between human beings and the natural world. Instead of seeing ourselves as one of many species, as one of many beings to emerge on this planet, we saw ourselves as special, as set apart. While we are called to be good stewards in many places in the Bible, that is not the message we somehow internalized. Rather, it was the notion that human beings have dominion, have power over the rest of the earth. We heard in Psalm 8 this morning an expression of that viewpoint. When I look at your heavens, when I look at the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, what are human beings that you are mindful of them? The ancient writer of the Psalms exclaims. What are mortals that you care for them? Yet you have made them a little lower than God and crowned them with glory and honor. You have given them dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under their feet. Put all things under their feet. These words have been heard by generations of people as justification for doing whatever they wanted to the natural world. And yet, as our powers and as our technologies have grown, this assumption about the right to do whatever we want with impunity, this is assumption about being separate from nature, has become a real problem. The story is no longer working. Thomas Berry goes on to say, for people generally, their story of the universe and the human role in the universe is their primary source of intelligibility and value. The deepest crises experienced by any society are those moments of change when the story becomes inadequate for meeting the survival demands of the present situation. Word up, Thomas Berry. The deepest crises experienced by any society are those moments of change when the story becomes inadequate for meeting the survival. We are living during one of those moments of change, when the old stories are inadequate and the new stories are still struggling to emerge and to be heard. And what is this new story that's gradually catching on? Well, the new story correctly describes human beings as a primate species that emerged in Africa some 150 to 200,000 years ago, or maybe more. For most of our species history, we lived in small groups or tribes of anywhere from 50 to 100 people. Somewhere along the lines, we developed the faculty for verbal language that probably pushed our species down the evolutionary pathway of larger brains and greater intelligence. We also harnessed the power of fire and were able to cook our foods suddenly. Cooking food allowed us to digest more energy, which allowed our brains to grow. Instead of getting bigger and faster, our ancestors therefore got smarter. I heard one cynical evolutionary biologist wonder if this might be the single greatest maladaptation in the history of evolution on this planet. I guess the jury is still out on this point, which is also part of our story. This is how theologians and religious thinkers are starting to retell our story. It is a tale of a small, relatively weak species emerging and suddenly becoming self-aware. Suddenly there is this animal walking around on 2 feet, marveling at the wonders of the creation around them and asking themselves questions about right and wrong and how best to live. In addition to, should I eat that animal running by, or should I pick this plant and add it to my salad? This new story reconnects us to all of life on the planet, this time using the DNA in our cells that we have discovered to reveal this profound truth. The new story also reminds us of a truth that previous generations knew all too well, namely that the world is fantastically and amazingly interconnected, and that our lives depend on the health and well-being of the natural world. Therefore, humility is called for, not hubris, and finding ways to live more in harmony with the natural systems of this planet are called for. Instead of the messy and toxic business of digging up coal and oil and gas, we need to expand the ways that we can harness the sun and the wind and the tides and the heat of the earth for our energy needs. This is actually the greatest technical and moral challenge of this century. Indeed, to the extent that we confront the reality of climate change and turn to new ways to power our world and lives, including nuclear, I dare suspect, to the extent that we confront this reality is the extent to which we will be able to stave off the collapse of the world and our society as we know it. So when I look up and look over there, and I see solar panels on the roof behind us, on the church school wing, the solar panels that are now providing 85% of the church's power needs, I see the new story. When I hear about the growing adoption of electric vehicles, including an all-electric Ford F-150, hello, I see the new story. When I hear about Governor Baker's latest policies that support the emerging offshore wind industry here in New England and his programs to promote electric heating and cooling in buildings, I see the new story. When I hear about President Biden's proposals to support the expansion of wind and solar generation all over the country and investments in cities and towns to make our infrastructure more resilient and sustainable, I see the new story. And if it means taxing people like Jeff Bezos a little bit more to get some of this done for the sake of our own collective survival, then I say, so be it. When I see people from different political parties at least agreeing that the climate crisis is real and is a looming threat, I see the new story. Reality has a way of forcefully exerting itself, after all. When I see scientists wanting to talk about the sacredness of the web of life, and when I hear ministers praising renewable energy projects, and yes, when I see Captain Kirk of all people, finally getting into space and coming back alarmed about the plight of this relatively small, beautiful planet, our only home, I see the new story. A new story that is emerging slowly and taking hold. In the coming weeks, there are going to be a variety of debates and discussions about what we could and should do as people and as a country and as a world in order to stave off the worst of climate catastrophe. I hope and I pray that we will bend our ears to the new story that is circulating in our midst. Blessed are those who find ways to live more lightly on this planet, for they, and they alone, will inherit the earth. Amen.